Given the background of the growing threat from Russia-led Belarus, the question of protecting NATO's eastern flank is in particular the Baltic states arises, but your latest report says that NATO has no strategy to defend eastern flank from the against Putin's imperial ambitions. Could you explain your conclusion?
Yes, let me get something, let me clarify something first. I do not think it's right to call Eastern NATO's flank. It's the strategic front. And we need to start focusing on this. It is the front line, not a flank to something else. It consists of three strategic areas. The Baltic region, the center, and the Black Sea. And those three centers are overlapping in their relationship. Now, let's talk about strategy for a minute. The last time NATO had a serious military strategy that was consistent with its strategic principles was adopted in 1967 and ended approximately in 1990. It was called MC 14/3. 14 is the strategy document. MC stands for Military Committee in NATO. Since then, there have been a number of statements, some basically almost pacifistic, some focused on third world contingencies, expressing concern and so forth, and certainly more recently. But those statements are not a strategy. They're not a political strategy with military implications that have been explained. So flexible response, NATO's original strategy, had three levels: direct defense, escalation, and general response. Direct defense was involved in protecting the members of NATO. The escalation section, one side or the other could escalate, and it was important to have the ability to counter various levels of escalation or even escalate oneself to seize the initiative. And the overall response was essentially the American strategic deterrent, that in the end, if the Soviet Union started using nuclear weapons and creating horrific losses in Europe, the American strategic deterrent would be available, and the United States would defend or respond to attacks on European cities, just as we would our own. There is not an equivalent strategy today. General Sakur, just before the summit, mentioned that NATO's center of gravity is moving east. And he's using a Clausewitzian term. It was the famous German strategist Clausewitz defined center of gravity as the area of confrontation. So on NATO's strategic front, there are three major engagement areas that overlap, each of which has a center of gravity. So Russia and its battle with Ukraine is endangering NATO's southern center of gravity. If Ukraine falls, the weaker states and many of the newer states that have joined NATO are in the south. Ukraine provides a frontline protection for them. It also provides a critical protection in the center. There's one thing for Poland and NATO to try to deal with several Russian tank armies driving out of Belarus, but then also adding one or more armies coming out of western Ukraine if they were stationed there. So the conflict in Ukraine has an enormous impact on not only NATO's southern front, but the central front. The central front also overlaps with the northern front, and the northern front involves obviously the Baltic states. The significance of the addition of Finland and Sweden cannot be underestimated because it totally changes the stability and security potential of the northern front. Why do I say that? Prior to that, the three Baltic states have a very relatively shallow depth, and the only way to support them via land was through that very narrow corridor, the Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus. A gap that is increasingly getting narrower and narrower as Russians are deploying forces and building up on both in Kaliningrad and in Western Belarus. And they also did not have an effective air or air defense. There was no Patriots defending the Baltic states. They themselves did not have an air force, so NATO was rotating aircraft, sometimes 2, sometimes 4 from various member states. That's nice for air patrol. That is not a significant air defense. And as we have seen in Ukraine, if Russia dominates the air, no matter how strong, how committed a ground force is, they're operating under an extreme vulnerability by not having both a ground-based air defense like Patriot and a fighter base. Adding Finland extends the front, but it also means that the Russians have to extend their forces. So it dilutes the offensive potential that would normally be applied, for example, in the Baltic states. The Russians had the Sixth Army, essentially headquartered in St. Petersburg. Now part of that army is already being split and committed to Russians have a new military district for the north. So that's already splitting Russian forces. But the really strategic significance is twofold. One is Finland combined with Estonia essentially then dominates the estuary going into St. Petersburg from the Baltic. So instead of previous war games that the Russians had played, where they would take the part of the Baltic fleet from St. Petersburg and part of the fleet that's stationed in Kaliningrad, and they would combine those two elements and have the dominating fleet to be able to isolate the Baltic states, for example, and put a blockade in. It can now be cut off because of the combination or that narrow neck between Finland and Estonia. The second strategic impact is having Sweden. Sweden adds depth. What that depth means is that not only its naval forces can join those of Poland and provide a dominating naval presence and position throughout the Baltic, which then backs up, by the way, if one blockades the strait between Finland and Estonia. But most important is the contribution of Swedish Air Force. So all of a sudden now you have an Air Force that can backstop and help provide the air protection for the Baltic states. It's an enormous game changer. And it's not just for the impact of the Swedish Air Force, it's the basing potential so that other NATO air forces, particularly those, for example, coming from the United States or Great Britain, that have bases now, forward bases that they can bed down. They're not all concentrated in the Benelux and Germany, and they can now operate on a much wider area and give much more effective air-to-air defense. So I apologize for the long comment, but I kind of wanted to lay out both the definitional sense of strategy and the differentiation between front and flank. I can explain more about the strategy if you like, but anyway, that was my initial.
Let me lead a little bit. So I'm really wondering to hear. I want to hear maybe some your tips, advices, how to protect actually Suwalki Gap and what to do. And I also want to add from my side that we know that there is no enough air defense protection here, defense here. I mean that, for example, Baltic countries are asking allies to put more air defense systems here, but it's not successful, this request for now. And could you give us more details on this topic, how to defend the area? Yeah.
So let's divide it into two topics. First is being able to keep the Suwalki Gap open because you need that land bridge. Now, in the short term, I mean, for the next year or so. That threat, even though the Russians are putting in some of the Baltic, Wagner guys and so forth into Western Belarus, that threat's actually gone down, and I'll tell you why. There was an army corps that was defending Kaliningrad, or not defending. It involved several divisions and naval infantry and so forth. The Russians took that entire corps, or almost all of that, leaving only a cadre left in Kaliningrad, and committed it to the front in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians destroyed that corps. I mean, basically, not only eviscerated the equipment, but knocking out the either killing or wounding so many of the soldiers, and taking out some of the commanders. So it's going to take the Russians, I would say, at least a year to rebuild that capability in Kaliningrad. So we have, in a way, a breathing space. But we have to be very, very conscious. We only have a year. And so what do we need to do? Well, one of the things is the Poles are really stepping up. They're increasing their defense. They're building an entire new division and moving up forces exactly to be able to handle that contingency. But they can't do it by themselves. Also, NATO has agreed to increase. So in each of the 3 Baltic states, there's essentially equivalent of a battalion, a NATO battalion that gets rotated from different countries. It's great. Symbolism, very nice. Co-training, but that's not sufficient for real defense. So it's necessary and now NATO has said that, at least it looks like, there's going to be a commitment moving from a battalion to a brigade in each of the Baltic states. There's important to note that the Baltic states need to have a forward defense. Up till now, each of them has been basically, because of their own limited resources and having quite different forces. So they have small forces, and some are dependent on reserves, some are dependent on a combination, and so forth. And so up till now, they have really not had sufficient strength to do a forward defense. Why is the forward defense important? The terrain in Estonia, for example, is best defended as far forward as possible. If the Estonian forces are pushed back, or only screening their front and pushed back 50, 60 kilometers, it essentially compromises the northern access into Latvia. If the Latvians don't defend forward, you combine that force dropping down through the southern Estonia with a offensive force, and it can then drop down into the middle of Lithuania, compromising Lithuania from the north. The Russians have played that scenario in a number of their major military planning exercises against NATO, is called in Zapad 2017, for example, and more recently. So that's a dangerous deal, because it essentially opens up the gate for them to commit a tank army into the central Estonia. That tank army then would be combined with it coming down with a force coming out of Kaliningrad and another force coming out of Belarus. There isn't enough force in that narrow neck of the Suwalki Gap to defend. And the terrain itself doesn't really lend itself to having a kind of, so that means that NATO is going to have to counterattack. NATO is going to have enough offensive force to take, when the Russians try and close it, to break through, and then as far as the main river going through Lithuania, to stop that tank army from coming in. And so it requires several things: the Baltic countries defending further forward, having a stronger counterattack force, and providing the air protection, which we'll mention next. The U.S. is moving forces to pre-position them in Poland, and why that is important, not just for the U.S. but for any other countries contributing, is that if you have the equipment already there, if you come in several times a year and fly in troops, so that you don't have to have a lot of troops stationed in peacetime. So you fly in troops during a crisis period, and certainly training for that. They then fall in on that equipment, and that force is ready to go. To give you an example of how powerful that could be, at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. had the ability to bring in 4 divisions worth of manpower, and it was doubling the size of the U.S. Army in Germany, and adding in 1,000 aircraft, all within 10 days. Now, right now, the ability to do that is 10% of that, but that has significant potential as well. Likewise, the Germans, whose military has become pathetic, and now they say they're going to add more, but they need to build up their force so they can add at least in a division equivalent to back up the Poles opposite Kaliningrad. So there's the potential and there's the plans, but we don't have time to sit back on our haunches and say, oh, well, we'll get around to it. This really needs to be a serious effort. And that's why not having a strategy that is explicit, that people can understand and is focused on defending a front, and still treating Eastern Europe as a sideshow, as a flank, is so important to change that. Now, so again, looking back at NATO, NATO defended its front in the Cold War with 2 lines of air defense. It was called the Hawk Belt, and then behind, which were middle range air defense systems, and then behind it, basically along the Rhine, was the strategic belt called the Nike Hercules belt, long range. The Hawk Belt, the weapons for the Hawk Belt were purchased by individual countries for their forces, but everybody basically agreed to a standardized thing. 85% of the forward deployed middle range air defenses were standardized, and they could talk to each other and they were integrated. Some of the countries couldn't afford, the Benelux, for example, or Germany, when it was just becoming rearming, could not afford to pay for an expensive strategic air defense in the second line. So NATO took what was called common infrastructure funds, the common fund, and that Nike Hercules belt was built jointly for everybody. So it wasn't dependent on individuals or us having gaps. Why is that significant? Because if we view NATO as having a front that runs from the North Cape all the way down to the Black Sea, we need to extend the Patriots from Finland to the Baltic states. Poland's already buying Patriot, and then link that to the Patriots that are already in Ukraine. That gives you this crescent of integrated air defense, a larger umbrella. But as we see in Ukraine, the Russians will attack those Patriots, by the way, which have done phenomenal work in Ukraine. Their success rate is when this war is over, people can see the real data. But I can tell you, their success rate has been phenomenal and far beyond even our own expectations. But they can't defend themselves if Russia throws all their attack force against several batteries of Patriot. So you need to have layers of mid-range to help protect the Patriots against mid-range, and even smaller ones to protect against drones. So you can imagine a Patriot belt that comes from Finland down through the Baltics and links up to Poland and Ukraine. Half of that's already basically there. What we need to do is finish the other half, and no, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania individually or collectively cannot afford an integrated Patriot system. So the rest of us have to help. And it needs to be extended to Finland. And then that system needs to be linked with NATO air in the central region and NATO air in Sweden. So you have the air and air defense linked and can talk to each other, have identification friend or foe, makes it extremely powerful. There's no reason that within the next year or two that Patriot Belt couldn't be extended, like I said. Then the individual countries will need to buy and purchase systems that talk to Patriot, that talk to the command and control system, and they then provide the medium level and even the tactical level for their own forces.
Dr. Karber, and I want also to ask you maybe briefly, of course, countries should rely on themselves too, not only NATO. So what can you advise to Lithuania? What Lithuania should do to be prepared maximum what it can?
So, and this is where the missing NATO strategy that I complain about needs to be formulated. You need an active covering force so that there's always the potential of a surprise attack. As we saw in the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year, even though 12 armies are mobilizing on the Ukrainian border, it's very hard to politically make the decision because you're afraid of being provocative. It's expensive to call up reserves and so forth, redeploy forces. So you need to assume that any country is going to be, even if there's a long buildup, is going to find it surprising in the initial stage. That's why you have to have an active, what's called covering force, so that the roads aren't open, so that there are troops that will blow the bridges, that will provide the initial slowdown for the attack. That concept needs to be integrated across the countries. Right now, it isn't. If one then says, okay, we need a sufficient covering force, the covering force isn't going to stop a concentrated attack. The idea is to slow it down and beat the hell out of it so that its power is reduced and definitely its speed, so it's not able to overrun those countries in hours or a few days, but gets caught up in a slogging combat we see in Ukraine now. The second stage, that needs to be done by the locals, and the locals need to do what they can. But the rest of us then have to develop forces that some of it that are stationed there that can participate and help fill those gaps that the countries can't afford to do with an active force. Then the second stage is your main defense line. There, you can have reinforcing forces that are pre-committed but aren't there in peacetime. The country can have more of its forces that are called up on reserves. And you need the counterattack force that will come through the Suwalki Gap and march north. Eventually, I'm sure the Swedes will also want to have a contributing force from ground force from their side to protect Estonia. So that concept of a main line of defense, first covering force, active covering force, then a main line of defense with some active and some reserve and some reinforcing, and then territorials to protect the rear area because the Russians will attack. They will try and drop paratroopers in and so forth. So that needs to be articulated. That needs to be agreed by the states and individual members making their contribution. We're close. We just need to pull it all together now. And we have a unique opportunity. Let me add also, there's a famous line of Hemingway's book, John Donne's, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. It is in NATO's strategic interest to get Ukraine into the alliance. It is in the Baltic countries' interest because with Ukraine in NATO and having access for AWACS and surveillance all the way back, all along the whole length of Belarus, from two sides, from the NATO side, but from the Ukrainian side, gives you incredible insight into what's going on so that you can be prepared. So you know where the main thrust or Schwerpunkt is going to come of the attack. NATO draws Russian forces off. If Ukraine isn't in NATO, it is not only vulnerable to continuing attack, but to nuclear threats. So And if those nuclear threats can be applied to Ukraine, they can also the implications for the vulnerable Baltic states is extremely high. So the last element, even though they're separated, the Ukraine and the southern front actually has a strategic impact with the northern front, and vice versa.
Yes, it was my next question about why Ukraine's membership and Sweden membership are so important for NATO by themselves. And apparently you told everything on this topic. If you want to add something about this importance, you can, but it seems you told enough.
I asked my own question, or I answered my own question, sorry. I think we need to take a step back. Europe does. And realize that this is a strategic moment that affects all of Europe. I'm going to mention this as an American right now, because there's a debate. American support is not axiomatic, and Europeans should not assume that. There are people in the United States who say, "Oh, gee, why are we doing all this? We got problems here. Who else is going to go to the defense of Korea or Japan or Taiwan? You're not going to see your NATO forces there, except maybe a British contribution, but." So the United States does have worldwide commitments, and we spend a lot. So people ask, well, why should we care? But I think this has a lesson for all of NATO. But I tell them, remember in World War I, it started in Eastern Europe. The United States did not want to be neutral. We stayed out of it for 3 years. Finally, we couldn't take it anymore. We got dragged in. And we lost, it was 170,000 casualties. World War II. The United States wanted to be neutral. It's going on for several years. Right? Poland, first the occupations, and then invasion of Poland. And finally, we get dragged in, and something like 500,000 casualties. At the end of the Cold War, we waged the Cold War, not just to protect the NATO line, but also to end Russian occupation of the Baltic states, by the way, which we never recognized. We always viewed them from the 1920s as independent states, even if they were occupied, and Poland and the other East European countries. That was our policy. We won that war in the sense that that policy worked. Now we face the challenge. If we don't respond, if we Americans don't respond, it is inevitable that Russia will keep pushing as long as Putin's in charge. Russia's going to keep testing and pushing and pushing. And we will get dragged in. It is inconceivable that a Russian attack on the Baltic states or Poland and the United States is going to sit back and say, well, gee, we don't want to. We are committed strategically and politically. So again, every state, Portugal's future security is in fact dependent on what's happening in Eastern Europe on that front. Because if that front collapses, if that front goes to a major war, imagine a 2-year war on the scale that Ukraine is facing right now in NATO's central region. That can, and the proliferation, escalation of nuclear threats against targets all the way in the back of NATO. Everyone has a strategic need. Now, I want to get one last point, because Albert Wolstead, our famous American strategist, used to use the phrase, maximum ways to confuse ourselves. We have to get rid of this idea that NATO expansion threatened Russia militarily. It didn't. As countries joined NATO, from NATO's perspective, we were trying to do two things. One, educate their diplomatic and military from the old communist system to Western values, to the idea of military being responsive to a democratic leadership, training a new generation of officers and diplomats, helping them integrate their weaponry and so forth with NATO, so it's going to be standard European. And secondly, reducing their bloated military force structure. I mean, Poland had like 15 divisions. Hungary had 4 or 5. We helped them basically disarm. So the amount of force, military assets in Eastern Europe as countries joined NATO went down by over 65%. So it was 1/3 the amount of military assets in Eastern Europe because they joined NATO. Now, NATO was a political threat to Russia. Why? Because if you have a leader who thinks of himself as a new czar and has said he wants to bring back, he wants to bring the countries that were, or the peoples that were part of the Russian Empire, Finland, the Baltic states, half of Poland, Ukraine, et cetera, back into Russia. He said, well, they have the right to have their little culture and to have their sort of internal stuff, but they have to be, and we have to be in charge. We have to control them militarily and politically in terms of internationally. So yes, the idea that NATO is supporting these countries to be independent and sovereign and have self-determination is a threat to someone who has an imperial ambition. No, this is not a collision of zones of control, but the United States is backing up countries who want to be sovereign and independent. And that coalition of states does not threaten Russia unless Russia changes leadership. Or if Russia changes leadership, they could be even part of that collective security group. Anyway, I think, in conclusion, I think it's important for everyone to realize that we all have a strategic interest in, one, ending the war in Ukraine, ensuring that Russia cannot win by taking pieces of countries and then having some kind of ceasefire. Oh, we got to end the war, right? And third, creating a military security strategy that is articulated and says, okay, what are our defense concepts? For defense, main line of resistance, response to escalation, and tying in the entire American security umbrella.